Listen, I understand how this must sound to you. Really, I do. A woman inherits property in the middle of nowhere and suddenly starts talking about Bigfoot living in the woods. You're probably assuming I'm trying to attract tourists or planning to write some sensational book to cash in on the current cryptid fever. Maybe you think I'm setting up some kind of roadside attraction where people pay admission to hear fabricated stories and look at plaster casts of fake footprints. But that's not what this is about at all, not even remotely. I've deliberately kept this information completely private for the past 14 years, specifically because I didn't want curiosity seekers and amateur investigators and television crews trampling through here, disrupting what exists on this land, destroying through exposure and intrusion what has been carefully protected for decades. The only reason I'm finally sharing any of this now is that I'm approaching 50 years old, and the reality of mortality has started weighing on my mind in ways it didn't before, ways I couldn't have anticipated when I was younger and felt invincible. I've come to believe that someone else needs to know about this situation, needs to understand what's really happening here in these mountains before I'm gone and the knowledge dies with me, before this extraordinary thing is lost, because I failed to pass on what I've learned and experienced. Whether you choose to believe what I'm telling you is entirely your decision to make, and I respect that completely. I'm not invested in convincing skeptics or changing anyone's worldview or winning arguments with people who've already decided that creatures like this cannot possibly exist. I'm simply documenting the truth of my experience exactly as it happened and continues to happen, creating a record that might help someone in the future, someone who might find themselves in a similar situation, someone who might inherit this responsibility when I'm no longer capable of fulfilling it. This is testimony, not entertainment. This is truth, not fiction crafted for effect. When my aunt died in early autumn of 2010, I found myself unexpectedly inheriting her entire estate. This consisted of 420 acres of densely forested mountain land in the Appalachian region of Western Virginia, not far from the West Virginia border, where the mountains rise steep and ancient from the valleys below. The call came from her lawyer, a man I'd never met, on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting in my cubicle staring at spreadsheets that felt so meaningless they might as well have been written in a dead language. "Your Aunt Catherine has passed away," he said, his voice professionally detached. "You're the sole beneficiary of her estate." I'd barely known my aunt, had seen her maybe 5 times in my entire life at family gatherings she reluctantly attended, always seeming uncomfortable in those settings, a wild bird trapped in a cage, always departing early with vague excuses. She was my father's younger sister, and they'd never been close after she'd moved to the mountains in the mid-1970s, following a messy divorce. The family had mostly written her off as eccentric, the odd one who'd chosen isolation over normal life, who'd rejected conventional success and stability for some incomprehensible reason no one understood. My aunt had lived alone on that property for nearly 35 years, rarely venturing into the small town 15 miles away, except when absolutely necessary to purchase supplies she couldn't produce herself. Things like flour and coffee and tools that required manufacturing she couldn't replicate in isolation. The local residents considered her eccentric at best and possibly mentally unstable at worst. One of those mountain hermits who'd rejected society and human companionship for reasons that marked them as damaged or strange. But the truth, which I would only come to understand much later, was that she simply valued her privacy above everything else and had grown weary of human society with all its complications and hypocrisies and endless demands for conformity to expectations she found suffocating. She'd found something in those mountains, something that made conventional human society feel shallow and meaningless by comparison. She left everything to me in a meticulously prepared will that ran 15 pages and detailed every aspect of the property transfer. This included the modest but sturdy cabin she'd constructed with her own hands over the course of several years in the early 80s, using lumber harvested from the land itself, and a handwritten letter that contained only one sentence of instruction that I initially dismissed as meaningless philosophical rambling. The sentence read, "Give the mountain time to accept you and honor what you find there." At the time I received this cryptic message, sitting in the lawyer's office signing document after document, I had absolutely no framework for understanding what she meant. I assumed she was speaking metaphorically about adapting to rural life, the adjustment period required when transitioning from urban environments to remote isolation, or perhaps making some philosophical statement about patience and observation in natural settings, about learning to slow down and pay attention to rhythms different from city life. I certainly didn't imagine she was giving me literal instruction about something extraordinary living on that property, something that would require specific protocols and approaches. I was 34 years old then, trapped in a soul-crushing administrative position at a corporate office in Richmond. I spent 40 hours a week minimum, often more like 50 or 55, in a beige cubicle under harsh fluorescent lights that hummed incessantly and gave me headaches. I performed tasks that felt utterly meaningless and disconnected from anything that mattered in the world, contributing nothing of value to society or to my own sense of purpose and fulfillment. I processed paperwork and attended meetings and wrote reports that no one read, and participated in corporate initiatives that existed only to justify someone's job or create the appearance of productivity. The work was mind-numbing in its tedium, soul-destroying in its pointlessness. I'd wake up every morning with a sense of dread, knowing I had to go back to that office, sit in that cubicle, pretend to care about things that didn't matter. The prospect of doing this for another 30 years until retirement felt like a prison sentence, a slow death of everything that made life worth living. The prospect of owning all that mountain land represented a possibility of escape that felt almost miraculous. An opportunity to completely restart my life along different principles, to live according to values I actually believed in, rather than corporate expectations and social conventions I'd never agreed to follow. It felt like a door had opened in a wall I'd been staring at for years, a way out of a trap I'd walked into without fully realizing what I was giving up. An escape from fluorescent lights and spreadsheets and meaningless meetings and the constant low-level anxiety that had become my normal state of being. A chance to live differently, to find out what life might feel like if I made choices based on what actually mattered to me rather than what society said I should want. I submitted my resignation within 3 weeks of receiving the inheritance paperwork, writing a brief letter that gave 2 weeks' notice and cited personal reasons for leaving. My supervisor seemed baffled, tried to talk me out of it, offered me a raise and a promotion that would have meant more money but also more responsibility and more time trapped in that building. I declined politely and worked my remaining days, clearing out my desk, deleting files, wrapping up projects that would be reassigned to someone else who would care as little as I had. My co-workers treated me like I was making a terrible mistake, abandoning security and benefits for some romantic fantasy about rural life that would inevitably disappoint me. They asked what I would do for money, for health insurance, for social connection. They warned me about isolation and boredom and the harsh realities of living without modern conveniences. I smiled and nodded and didn't try to explain that those conveniences felt like chains, that isolation sounded like paradise compared to open-plan offices and forced socializing, that boredom would be preferable to the chronic anxiety I'd been living with. I methodically packed up everything that mattered from my small one-bedroom apartment, which turned out to be surprisingly little. Most of what I owned was furniture and electronics and clothes that seemed designed for the life I was leaving rather than the one I was entering. I sold or donated most of it, keeping only essentials, books, camping equipment, tools, and warm clothes suitable for mountain winters. I said goodbye to the few friends I'd managed to maintain, despite my chronic dissatisfaction with city life. People I'd known for years, but had never been truly close to, relationships that felt surface level and maintained more from habit than genuine connection. They wished me luck with the kind of tone that suggested they thought I was making a huge mistake, but were too polite to say so directly. And then I loaded everything I was keeping into my aging Toyota pickup truck and drove west into the mountains to begin whatever this new chapter of existence would become, driving away from Richmond with a feeling of liberation so intense it was almost frightening in its power. I remember the drive vividly, watching the city fade in my rearview mirror, watching the landscape gradually transform from suburbs to small towns to forest, feeling like I was shedding an old skin, becoming someone different with each mile that passed. The adjustment was considerably more challenging than I'd naively anticipated. There was no internet connectivity whatsoever. Cell phone service was unreliable at best and completely absent in most parts of the property, and my nearest neighbor lived roughly 12 miles away down a rutted dirt road that became completely impassable during heavy rain or winter snow. But I found myself appreciating the profound quiet in ways I hadn't expected, craving it actually, needing that absence of human noise and complication. The cabin my aunt had built was small, but remarkably well constructed, demonstrating genuine skill and attention to structural detail that impressed me immediately upon first seeing it. She'd clearly known what she was doing, had taken time to learn proper building techniques, hadn't cut corners or settled for adequate when she could achieve excellent. It contained one bedroom with a window facing east to catch morning light, positioned perfectly so that sunrise would wake you naturally without need for alarm clocks, a design choice that demonstrated understanding of natural rhythms. There was a kitchen area, equipped with a wood-burning stove that served both cooking and heating functions, along with a small sink connected to a hand pump that drew water from a spring located uphill from the cabin, providing clean, cold water through simple gravity feed. The living space was centered around a stone fireplace she'd built using rocks gathered from the property, each stone carefully selected and fitted, the craftsmanship evident in how perfectly the stones locked together without mortar in places, creating a structure that would last centuries, and a covered porch that offered sweeping views of forested ridges extending in every direction as far as vision could reach. Layers of blue-hazed mountains fading into distance, a view that never became ordinary, no matter how many times I looked at it. She'd constructed everything using lumber harvested from her own land, cutting and milling the timber herself, with equipment that still sat in a small shed behind the cabin, a portable sawmill and various hand tools all carefully maintained and stored. The interior walls were lined with shelves containing hundreds of books covering topics from natural history to philosophy to practical skills like carpentry, foraging, and animal tracking, along with numerous journals filled with her handwritten observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, plant phenology, and other naturalist notes accumulated over decades of attentive observation. I spent hours reading these journals during my first months on the property, learning from her detailed records, understanding how she documented everything about this land with scientific precision. Her handwriting was neat and legible, her observations specific and detailed. She'd noted the exact dates when certain wildflowers bloomed each year, had tracked wildlife population changes over decades, had recorded weather patterns and compared them year to year. There was no television, no computer, no connection to the constant stream of digital information and entertainment that dominates contemporary life and keeps people distracted from direct experience. Just the forest, the mountains, the creek that ran through the valley below year-round regardless of drought conditions, and silence so complete it initially felt oppressive, almost uncomfortable. until I learned to hear the subtle sounds that filled it rather than defining it as an absence of noise. The silence wasn't actually silent once you paid attention. It was full of wind moving through different types of trees, each species creating distinct sounds, full of bird calls and insect songs, and the distant rushing of water over rocks, full of branches creaking and leaves rustling and all the small sounds that comprise the ambient noise of wild places when humans aren't drowning them out with mechanical noise. During my first several months on the property, I dedicated most of my energy to basic maintenance and necessary repairs to the cabin and outbuildings, clearing years of accumulated brush from the trails my aunt had established and systematically exploring different sections of the land to develop intimate familiarity with its geography and character. I would spend entire days walking through the forest, sometimes covering 10 or 12 miles in a day, trying to understand what had captivated my aunt so completely about this place that she'd willingly spent more than 3 decades here in virtual isolation. The forest was dominated by mature oak, hickory and tulip poplar trees with dense understory layers of rhododendron and mountain laurel that created nearly impenetrable thickets in some areas. White-tailed deer were abundant to the point of being almost commonplace. I'd see them daily. Wild turkeys moved through the property in large flocks. Black bears were present, though generally avoided direct encounters with humans. The bird diversity was remarkable. Species I'd only seen in field guides suddenly became daily companions. The land felt vital and alive in ways that urban environments, with their pavement and managed landscaping, could never approximate. I began noticing unusual occurrences around the beginning of my 4th month on the property. Initially, these were minor things that didn't immediately strike me as particularly significant or meaningful. I would discover carefully constructed cairns of stacked stones near the creek bank, sometimes 4 or 5 rocks balanced impossibly on top of one another in formations that clearly weren't the result of natural geological processes or random chance. My first assumption was that my aunt must have created these structures years ago, perhaps as trail markers or simply as a meditative practice. But the property boundaries were clearly posted with no trespassing signs, and there were no hiking trails or public access easements that would explain visitors creating these markers. Then I started encountering arrangements of broken branches that appeared overnight in locations where I'd walked the previous day, branches deliberately bent and woven together to form distinct X-shaped patterns or arched structures, definitely not the random result of storm damage or falling limbs. I tried to rationalize these findings as natural phenomena, perhaps deer rubbing velvet from their antlers or bears marking territory. But the explanations felt inadequate and unconvincing even as I told them to myself. The branches were positioned too high off the ground, sometimes 8 or 9 feet up in trees. The patterns showed too much intentionality and complexity. These were manipulated deliberately with significant strength and patience by something capable of reaching high into trees and weaving living branches together without breaking them. I also discovered tracks that didn't correspond to any wildlife species I could identify through my field guides or online research. These were enormous impressions in soft mud near the creek and in patches of bare soil along the trails, measuring at least 17 inches in length and showing 5 distinct toe marks, along with what appeared to be a clear heel impression. They were far too large to be black bear tracks and completely wrong in shape and proportion. Too wide, too human-like in configuration despite the size. When I found a sequence of these tracks, the stride length between them suggested something walking upright with a gait that covered significantly more ground than my own steps. Something tall and powerful moving through the forest on 2 legs rather than 4. Whatever creature was making these impressions was substantial in size and clearly bipedal, walking through my property on a regular basis based on How frequently I encountered fresh tracks. One morning in mid-September, I woke up and stepped out onto the porch to find a section of deer carcass placed directly in front of the cabin door. It was the hind quarter, relatively fresh. Couldn't have been more than a few hours old based on the condition of the meat and the fact that blood was still somewhat fluid. The flesh had been torn away from the bone rather than cut with any kind of blade, the ragged edges showing tooth marks or perhaps fingers, definitely not the clean cuts a knife would produce. My immediate thought was that a bear must have left this, but that explanation dissolved quickly under scrutiny. Bears don't leave food behind uneaten. They're opportunistic feeders who consume everything available, and this hadn't been dropped or dragged onto the porch through happenstance. It was deliberately placed, positioned with clear intentionality, right where I would immediately see it upon opening the door. This was a gift, an offering which implied conscious thought and purpose behind the action. I experienced genuine fear in that moment. I won't pretend otherwise. I retrieved the rifle my aunt had kept in the cabin, a lever-action 30-30 that I'd been practicing with at a makeshift range, and carried it out to the porch where I sat for over an hour, scanning the tree line in every direction, watching for movement, listening for sounds that might indicate what had left this offering. Nothing stirred except wind moving through leaves and the normal ambient sounds of the forest, birds calling, the distant creek burbling over rocks. I considered calling someone for help or advice, but the absurdity of that conversation stopped me. What exactly would I report? Sheriff's Department, something left meat on my porch. Can you send a deputy to investigate? They would think I was having some kind of psychological episode, a city woman who couldn't handle rural isolation and was inventing dramas. I wrapped the deer meat in plastic bags and stored it in the freezer, then scrubbed the porch boards clean with a brush and soapy water. That night, I barely slept, sitting up repeatedly at every small sound, the rifle propped within reach against my bedside table, but nothing unusual occurred. The night passed with only typical nocturnal sounds. Owls hunting, coyotes yipping in distant valleys. Approximately 10 days later, the same thing happened again. This time the offering was a rabbit, already skinned and gutted, the meat clean and ready for cooking, positioned in exactly the same location on the porch as the previous gift. My fear had diminished considerably by this second occurrence, replaced primarily by intense curiosity and the beginning of understanding. Whatever entity was leaving these offerings clearly wasn't attempting to frighten me or drive me away from the property. If harm or intimidation were the intention, there were countless opportunities for a large, powerful creature to accomplish that objective easily. I was vulnerable here, alone and isolated, far from any possibility of assistance. But instead of threatening behavior, I was receiving food, sustenance, provisions that required effort and skill to acquire. This indicated intention and thought, possibly even what might be interpreted as a kindness or a welcoming gesture from something that recognized my presence and was choosing to interact positively. I made a decision that felt simultaneously intuitive and slightly absurd. I would reciprocate, would offer something in return, would attempt to establish communication through this exchange of gifts. The logic of this decision was murky, even to myself, operating more on instinct than rational planning, but it felt correct in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I selected several apples from the supply I'd brought from town, walked to the edge of the clearing where forest growth began, and carefully arranged them on a flat boulder that jutted from the ground. Then I returned to the cabin and positioned myself at the window where I could observe the boulder without being obvious about my surveillance. I felt ridiculous, like someone trying to befriend a ghost or attempting to communicate with an entity that probably didn't exist outside my imagination. But I couldn't shake the powerful intuition that something real and intelligent was reaching out, attempting to make contact, and that responding appropriately mattered more than maintaining skeptical detachment. Nothing happened for hours. Afternoon faded into evening, evening into full darkness, and eventually I gave up my vigil and went to bed, uncertain whether this experiment had been a foolish waste of effort or the beginning of something significant. When I emerged from the cabin the following morning and walked to the boulder to check, the apples had vanished completely. In their place sat a neat arrangement of wild pawpaw fruits, several handfuls of them positioned in a small pyramid on the exact spot where I'd left my offering. My heart began racing, pulse quickening with a combination of excitement and disbelief and something approaching awe. This was unmistakable communication, proof of intelligence and intention and understanding of reciprocity, the social contract of exchange that forms the foundation of relationship. Something in these mountains was consciously reaching out to me, deliberately making contact, demonstrating comprehension of gift-giving as a form of language and connection. I maintained this pattern of exchange consistently over the following weeks and months. Every few days, I would leave something at that boulder, or sometimes in other locations around the clearing, fruit and nuts and bread, and occasionally cooked food left over from my meals. And every single time, without fail, whatever I left would be taken and something would be left in its place. More wild fruits, unusual varieties I hadn't known grew on the property, perfect pine cones arranged in geometric patterns. Once a bird's nest that had fallen intact from a high branch, delicate and complex in its construction. Once a collection of smooth river stones in different colors, white and gray and pink and green, arranged in a perfect circle. These exchanges became a ritual that structured my days, gave me something to anticipate, made me feel less isolated despite the absence of human contact. I was no longer alone on this mountain. I was in dialogue with something, sharing space and establishing a relationship, even if I still didn't fully understand what that something was. The night I actually witnessed the creature itself was in late October, about 7 months after I'd moved onto the property. I was sitting on the porch after finishing dinner, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket against the chill autumn air that carried the sharp scent of the frost that would come before morning. I was drinking tea that had gone lukewarm while I'd been distracted by watching the stars emerge one by one as twilight deepened into full night. The forest around me was relatively quiet, just the usual sounds of owls beginning their hunts with their questioning hoots and harsh screams, crickets providing their ambient rhythm that would continue until a hard freeze silenced them for the season. Then I heard something moving through the trees to the north of the cabin, something that made no attempt at stealth or concealment, something that clearly wasn't concerned about being heard or detected. Branches snapped audibly under significant weight, loud cracks that echoed through the quiet evening, sounds that made clear whatever was approaching was massive and moving without particular care. Heavy footfalls created vibrations I could feel through the porch boards even at a distance, rhythmic impacts that suggested something large and bipedal rather than the quadrupedal gait of a deer or bear. My first instinct was that an elk had wandered onto the property, but the rhythm of movement was completely wrong. This was bipedal locomotion without question. 2 legs, not 4, heavy, deliberate steps that suggested substantial mass moving in an upright posture. My heart started racing, adrenaline flooding my system with that particular electric feeling that comes with potential danger or extraordinary events. I stood slowly from my chair, instinctively reaching for the rifle that I'd begun keeping propped against the porch railing after those earlier unusual occurrences, my hand closing around the familiar worn wood of the stock. But something stopped me from actually picking it up. Some intuitive sense that displaying a weapon would be the wrong response, that whatever was approaching wasn't a threat in the way bears or mountain lions might be, that this situation called for openness rather than a defensive posture. My hand released the rifle, and I stood there empty-handed, vulnerable, waiting to see what emerged from the darkness. The footsteps halted at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 60 feet from where I stood frozen on the porch, my breath visible in the cold air, my heart hammering so hard I could feel the pulse in my throat. I could see a shape in the darkness where forest met clearing, tall and broad, but insufficient moonlight prevented detailed observation, reducing the figure to a silhouette against a slightly less dark background, a shadow among shadows. But even as a silhouette, the shape was massive, towering at least 8 or 9 feet tall from what I could estimate. The shoulders were wide, broader than any humans, broader than seemed physically possible, suggesting strength and power beyond anything I'd encountered. This wasn't an animal standing on its hind legs temporarily. This was a bipedal creature, something that walked upright naturally, something that belonged in mythology and legend rather than standing 60 feet away from me in documented reality. We remained in that frozen tableau for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. Me standing motionless on the porch, barely breathing, the shape standing equally motionless at the forest edge, both of us assessing the other across the space that separated us. The silence was absolute except for my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Time seemed to slow or stop entirely. Then the shape moved slightly, shifting weight from one leg to the other in a gesture that seemed almost nervous or uncertain, and made a sound that changed everything. The vocalization wasn't aggressive or threatening, wasn't a roar or growl. It was a low vocalization that seemed to carry meaning I couldn't translate, complex and modulated, almost like words in a language I didn't know, sounds that rose and fell with what seemed like intentional phrasing, communication rather than simple animal noise. The sound conveyed some combination of curiosity and caution and possibly even greeting. My fear, which had spiked initially, began draining away, replaced by intense curiosity and a strange sense of privilege, of being given access to something rare and important. This was the source of the gifts, the creator of the stone stacks and branch arrangements. This was the being that had been sharing this mountain with my aunt for decades, that had accepted her presence, and that was now extending that same tentative acceptance to me. This was Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name people used for something that supposedly existed only in mythology and blurry photographs. Except it wasn't mythology. It was standing right there in front of me, 60 feet away, but absolutely real. I didn't know what to do, so I simply raised one hand slowly in what I hoped would be interpreted as a gesture of peace and acknowledgement. The shape remained still for several more seconds. Then I saw what might have been its arm lifting in a similar gesture, mirroring my movement. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, moving with surprising silence for something so large, and within moments the sound of its passage had faded completely, leaving me alone on the porch in darkness, trembling slightly with adrenaline and wonder, and the profound realization that everything I thought I understood about the world had just been revealed as incomplete. I barely slept that night, replaying those moments over and over, but the evidence was too substantial to dismiss. The tracks, the gifts, the arranged stones and branches, all of it pointed to something real. My aunt had known, I realized with sudden clarity. That cryptic note about honoring what I found on the land, about giving the mountain time to accept me, she'd been trying to communicate this exact situation without stating it explicitly. She'd lived here with this creature for over 30 years, had developed a relationship with it, had been accepted by it, and now it was attempting to extend that acceptance to me. The pattern of our interaction evolved gradually over the months and years that followed. I continued leaving gifts. The creature, whom I began thinking of as female, though I had no real evidence beyond intuition, continued reciprocating. I began seeing her more frequently, though always at a distance. She would appear at the edge of the clearing in early morning or evening twilight, standing motionless while we observed each other. She was enormous, probably 8.5 feet tall, covered in dark, reddish-brown fur. Her face, when I occasionally glimpsed it in better light, was simultaneously human and not human, with a heavy brow ridge and broad flat nose, but eyes that conveyed unmistakable intelligence and emotion. One incident in particular solidified our relationship. It was early spring of my second year on the property. I was several miles from the cabin, clearing a section of trail, focused intensely on my work and not paying adequate attention to my surroundings. A black bear, a mature male of over 300 pounds, emerged from thick undergrowth about 20 feet away. It was mating season, and male bears are often more aggressive. This one stood on its hind legs, a clear display of dominance, and made a huffing sound that communicated aggression. It then dropped to all fours and took several deliberate steps toward me. Its ears were back, its mouth slightly open, showing teeth. I realized with cold terror that this situation might escalate into a physical attack. I had no weapon with me. Before I could decide on any response, something massive crashed through the forest from my right side with shocking speed and power. The Bigfoot appeared, moving faster than I would have thought possible, and positioned herself between me and the bear in a protective stance that was unmistakable in its intention. She put her body directly in the path of the threat. She made a vocalization that was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since, a roar so powerful and primal that I felt it resonating in my chest cavity. The bear's reaction was immediate and absolute. It backed down, retreating into the undergrowth in obvious submission or outright fear, fleeing from the Bigfoot with obvious terror. The entire encounter had lasted maybe 30 seconds. The Bigfoot remained in her protective stance for another moment, then turned to look at me, and our eyes met directly for the first time. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, but with a depth and intelligence that was startling in its humanity. She held my gaze for several seconds, and I understood without words that she was checking whether I was injured. I nodded, which seemed to satisfy her, and she turned and walked back into the forest, leaving me standing on the trail, shaking with adrenaline and gratitude. That incident changed everything, transforming our relationship from cautious coexistence to something that felt like genuine care and protection. She had intervened to save my life. From that point forward, I understood that we weren't simply two beings sharing space. We were connected. As years passed, our relationship deepened. I learned to interpret the different sounds she made. A particular ascending hoot meant she was nearby. A lower grunt seemed to indicate contentment. A sharp bark-like sound served as a warning. I developed my own repertoire of sounds and gestures that she appeared to understand. Winter was particularly significant. My second winter brought a severe storm that dumped over 3 feet of snow. On the third night of the storm, I heard heavy footsteps on the porch. I looked out the window to see the Bigfoot standing there, covered in snow, checking on the cabin. When she saw me, she made that acknowledging grunt, then disappeared back into the blizzard. After the storm passed, I discovered she'd cleared snow from around the woodshed door and broken ice on the spring that fed my water supply. These were deliberate, helpful actions that demonstrated planning and concern for my welfare. I also discovered she'd apparently been protecting the property from human intrusion. Twice, I found evidence that hunters had attempted to cross onto my land despite the posted boundaries, game cameras and tree stands. Both times, these items had been systematically destroyed, cameras smashed and tree stands torn down, before I'd even discovered them. The Bigfoot was actively patrolling the boundaries, preventing encroachment. People occasionally ask me, on my infrequent trips to town, how I manage living alone so far from everything, whether I get lonely. I tell them I enjoy the solitude, which is true but incomplete. I don't mention that I'm not actually alone, that I share this mountain with something remarkable. How could I explain that without sounding delusional? I haven't told a single person about this situation in all these years. The temptation to document everything, to gather evidence and prove to the world that these creatures are real, has occasionally been strong. But I understand what would happen. Researchers would descend on this place. The Bigfoot would be driven away, her home destroyed, her peace shattered, or worse, someone might try to capture her. I won't be responsible for that. I won't betray the trust she's placed in me. My aunt understood this. She lived here for 35 years, maintaining this exact same secrecy, protecting this creature. She passed that responsibility to me, and I've dedicated my life to honoring that trust. I saw the Bigfoot yesterday evening. She appeared at the clearing edge right around sunset. We've developed a routine. I sit on the porch steps, she stands at the tree line, and we spend time together in comfortable silence. Last night she stayed for nearly an hour. The moon rose nearly full, providing enough light that I could see her clearly. At one point she made that soft grunt that I've learned indicates contentment, and I made a similar sound back to her. Eventually she turned and walked unhurriedly up the slope. I watched until she completely disappeared into darkness. Then I went inside, built up the fire, and sat thinking about how extraordinary and unlikely and precious this whole situation is. This is my life now, and I wouldn't change it for anything. My days are spent maintaining the property, tending my garden, reading and walking the trails. My evenings are often spent on the porch, sometimes alone, sometimes in the company of a creature that shouldn't exist but does. It's a good life. Certainly more meaningful than the career I left behind. I think my aunt knew this would happen. I think she recognized something in me that suggested I could handle this responsibility, that I would protect rather than exploit. She was passing on more than real estate. She was passing on a legacy of protection and care, a sacred trust. I hope I can do the same when my time comes. I hope I can identify someone worthy of inheriting this place, someone who will continue the work my aunt started and I've maintained, someone who will protect the Bigfoot and keep the secret. That's what matters most, not proving anything to skeptics. What matters is protection, preservation, ensuring that this particular Bigfoot can continue existing without human interference. Sometimes I wonder what she thinks of me, whether she sees me as a friend or simply a tolerated presence. I'll never know for certain. We don't speak the same language, and the gulf between our species is too vast for complete understanding. But we communicate through gestures and gifts, and the simple act of showing up for each other consistently over time. Maybe that's sufficient. Maybe that's all any relationship truly requires. The sun is setting now as I finish writing this account. Light is turning golden across the ridges. I'll go out to the porch soon, sit with my evening tea, and watch the forest as day transitions to night. And maybe, if circumstances align, I'll see the Bigfoot at her usual spot at the clearing edge, and we'll spend time together in that comfortable silence that has become our primary mode of connection. That's my hope anyway. When I eventually grow too old to maintain this property alone, I'll need to find someone worthy of inheriting this place and this responsibility. Someone who understands what they're truly inheriting isn't just land, but a sacred trust. Finding such a person won't be easy, but it's essential. This isn't about proving anything. It's about honoring the trust that this Bigfoot has placed in me and in my aunt before me. It's about being a guardian. So if you're hearing this and thinking I'm delusional, that's acceptable to me. I've chosen this life deliberately, and I would make the same choices again without hesitation. The Bigfoot is real, living on this property. She's peaceful and intelligent and worthy of protection. That's the truth, regardless of whether anyone believes it. And I'm going to spend whatever years I have remaining ensuring she stays safe, stays hidden, stays free. That's my promise. For as long as I'm alive and able, I'll be here on this mountain, watching over this land and the remarkable creature that calls it home.